This ancient city of Caesarea Philippi lies along the northern border of Israel. The New Testament Gospels describe an unusual conversation in this remote region, a conversation that revealed more about Jesus as the Messiah of Israel. But some scholars say this conversation never happened, that claims about Jesus and his messianic secret were added later. Another group of scholars have come to a different conclusion. They spent a decade analyzing key events in the life of Jesus and now present historical evidence for the portrait of Jesus as described in the Gospels. Jesus, man, Messiah, or more, on this day of discovery.
Along with many other visitors, we've come here to Caesarea Philippi in the north of Israel to take a thoughtful look at an important event in the life of Jesus. It was here in this region that Jesus affirmed Peter when Peter declared Jesus to be the long-awaited Messiah and King of Israel. But because there are those who believe that Peter's statement was just too clear and too bold, there are those who believe that the early church must have written that back into the account some years later. Because of such challenges, we've decided to take another look.
Jesus and his disciples went on to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. On the way, he asked them, "Who do people say I am?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others, one of the prophets." "But what about you, Peter?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Peter answered, "You are the Christ." The Gospel of Mark, chapter 8.
To learn more about the historical reliability of the Gospel account, we've accepted an invitation to spend a few days with these New Testament scholars. For more than a decade, they've been attempting to answer the question, do you need to accept that the Bible is the Word of God to find the story of Jesus historically believable?
Well, when we approach these passages in the Gospels and look at these events, we do not assume that they're historical simply because they're in the Bible. We have respect, of course, for Scripture, but as historians we look at these episodes and ask ourselves, did these things happen? On what basis, on what criteria do we conclude that these things happen? And each one, event by event, passage by passage, must be looked at carefully and critically. And before we judge them as authentic and historical, there must be good reasons for doing so.
Because the Gospels place the actions and teachings of Jesus in historical and geographical settings, these scholars have been using the tools of the historian to see if the Gospel story shows signs of being rewritten to reflect the faith of Jesus' followers from a later time. Though archaeologist Dr. Paul Wright was not himself part of the Jesus study group, we asked him to describe for us this remote region of northern Israel where, according to the New Testament Gospels, Peter made his dramatic statement about Jesus.
Caesarea Philippi is as far north, just about as far north, as near as we can tell, that Jesus ever got, at least in his recorded ministry. It's quite a ways. It's more than a day's walk from Capernaum, and quite a distance from Jerusalem. It became a city, actually. At the very base, the foot of Mount Hermon, tucked up against a high limestone cliff. At the base of the cliff is a large cave. Out of the cave in the first century flowed water, living water. One of the headwaters of the Jordan River, the Banyas Spring. At the base of the cave, already in the 2nd century BC, 1st century BC, in Jesus' day, certain paraphernalia, buildings, cuttings in the rock, other things related to the worship of the Greco-Roman god Pan, a god of the hunt, a god of nature, and a god of water, fertility, life, that sort of thing. And the prevailing opinion still is that out of the mouth of that cave, Herod the Great built a temple to the divine Caesar, Caesar Augustus. Herod's son Philip, the tetrarch, inherited the site, gave it a new name, Caesarea Philippi, after himself. In the Gospel of Matthew, we read that Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi. Maybe he wasn't standing right at the site, all right, but at least he knew what was going on there. And he came to the district of Caesarea Philippi, a place very Greco-Roman.
Many think Jesus had this site in mind when he asked the disciples who they thought he was. As the chosen 12, they knew him better than the crowds that had been following him through the Galilee. So Peter spoke up, expressed his convictions, only to find himself silenced by Jesus.
Simon Peter answered, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And I, Jesus, tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it." Then he warned his disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Christ. The Gospel of Matthew, chapter 16.
Among other things, Jesus says to Peter there in Caesarea Philippi, "You are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church." Peter had just confessed Jesus, stated his belief in him. There's a lot of talk about what the rock is in relationship to Peter, in relationship to the confession. I find it interesting that irrespective of the theological discussion and the historic discussion, that Jesus is calling Peter, and Petros means rock, of course, under the shadow of the mightiest rock in this land. It's a cliff over 100 feet high, but it goes back 25 miles. It's the toenail of Mount Hermon, you could say. A massive mountain block goes up to almost 10,000 feet in elevation. A huge rock. Rock doesn't mean pebble, doesn't mean piece of gravel. It means big massif of bedrock. It's a kind of a rock that provides strength and shelter and security. Essentially everything necessary for life: water, soil, building materials, strength and security. If the church isn't that, I don't know what it is. You are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church.
So why would Jesus wait until now to reveal his plans and the kind of Messiah he would be? Why did he choose this time to ask his disciples questions about his own identity?
This is about 2.5 years into Jesus' ministry. Peter's one of the ones who has been with him from the start.
Jesus has been teaching crowds. People have been following him. There have been healings. There have been parables that Jesus has told. He has been trying to instruct them. They know that something significant is happening. Could this be the one? And so that's the question that people are asking.
Well, what has been happening in Jesus' public activities is a gradual unveiling of his person and his identity. Step by step, his disciples see things about him, indeed even the public, and people cry out with amazement. He's considered a great teacher. He's considered a great prophet. Maybe he's even more than that.
So the region of Caesarea Philippi provided the setting for an important conversation between Jesus and his disciples. A remote place, removed from the noise and commotion of the crowds, for a conversation that some scholars say never happened.
Well, it's commonly called Peter's confession, but perhaps better called Peter's declaration. And the declaration is that Jesus is the Messiah. And that is really what Christians believed after the resurrection as well. So some scholars think it's really a creation of the early church. It's reading back into the life and ministry of Jesus, something that they believed, and they needed to have it affirmed in the story of Jesus.
But would the early followers of Jesus have told the story the way it's recorded if they were making it up? Well, not according to these scholars. The study group sees indicators that they believe consistently reflect real events, orchestrated intentionally by Jesus to reveal his identity and purpose. And here, near Caesarea Philippi, they see a strategic shift in the gospel record of the words and works of Jesus.
Jesus then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law, and that he must be killed, and after 3 days rise again. The Gospel of Mark, chapter 8.
in this passage itself comes the very first prediction that he is going to be arrested as he goes to Jerusalem. He is going to be crucified. He's going to be the suffering Messiah. And that's where the rub comes in with Peter. Because Peter gets part of it. He knows this is a different kind of Messiah. But now Jesus, in Matthew's Gospel, says, from that time, this is a major turning point. From that time.
And that time is what?
Where they're here, after they've finished the Galilee ministry. From that time, now that Jesus has been articulated to be the Messiah by his own people, we know who you are, Jesus. We get it. Okay. We get who you are. You are the Messiah. So Matthew says, from that time, Jesus began to show them that he must suffer. He'll be arrested, suffer, crucified. That's a major turning point.
So you could view this event as a supreme tipping point,
Oh,
chronological,
supreme, yes.
theological,
That's
geographical.
Right. That's right.
In
All the way
everything Jesus
around.
was doing.
What do you mean by that? A change of direction? Or
Well, it's now focused upon who he will be, but also now, in a sense, the end of the public ministry has come.
And he's got to fill in a picture. He's got to fill in a picture of who this figure is that he sees himself as being and becoming. And notice there's another interesting feature. Talking about Jesus. Notice what he says when he gets this declaration. When he gets this declaration, he doesn't say, "All right, boys, you finally got it. Let's go out and tell the world." What he says is, "Shh." Yeah.
Peter answered, "You are the Christ." Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. The Gospel of Mark, chapter 8.
Okay, why does he do that?
Well, he does that because although they've got it right that he is, if you will, someone unique, he's not a prophet, they don't understand the portrait of his uniqueness yet. They don't get that. And so what they need to do is to have that filled out. So the next thing that Jesus does is to announce this suffering element.
Yeah, now hold on, just one, let's go there. Just one thing to add in. As he says, don't tell anybody that he is the Christ, Peter's got it right, but do the people?
What people?
The people in this region, the people in the Galilee. If Jesus now declares, I am the Christ, what's going to happen is happen in John's Gospel. They rush him to make him king, political king. And Jesus, look, they don't get that yet. That's not the kind of Messiah I am. So don't go making this broadcast that I'm Messiah, because the people are going to want this conquering king. That's not the kind of king I am. I am actually going to be a suffering Messiah.
And so, and Peter doesn't get that element of it yet.
Right.
And so we got things happening on multiple levels. We got the people; they need to have the whole thing completely reoriented. Peter's understanding has got to be shaped.
And he says, no way, right?
He says no way in heaven. That's right. When this suffering comes, no way. And then the first response to him. I mean, think of Peter, what he's gone through. He's just gone through a declaration. He's been affirmed. And then the next thing that's said to him is, get behind me, Satan.
Jesus spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. "Get behind me, Satan," he said. "You do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of men." The Gospel of Mark, chapter 8.
Why did Jesus use such strong language? Get behind me, Satan.
Well, okay, Jesus now is declaring himself to be the messianic agent of God. He has come to earth to bring the kingdom to earth in God's fashion, not in what the people want. And
you mean by that, not in a political sense?
That's not in a political sense. And what has he just done? He has said, I'm going to the cross. I'm going to be the suffering Messiah. I'm going to go to the cross. And that is God's will for Jesus' entire mission. He isn't just a martyr who gets caught up in this. This is intentionality. And I know that I must be the suffering Messiah. Go ahead.
And when you finish out what he says, "Get behind me, Satan." You are not thinking about the things God is concerned about, but the things about man. So there's
people are interested
paths.
In that.
There's a path in which man would have him take and take control then, but he has a path that God has set out for him, and that's the one he's choosing.
Well, think about how we bring kingdoms today. Okay, if you're going to bring a kingdom, you're going to take over something. What would you do? You'd be organizing armies, you'd be having generals. It'd be a raw use of power. Okay, that's not what Jesus is going to do. He doesn't have a single general with him.
Yeah.
You know, there aren't armies and legions with him. There is Jesus and these 12 rather average guys. And they are going to go out and they're going to talk about how God is going to absolutely overwhelm the creation with a message. I mean, their army is a word. Yeah. Their army is a message.
And nobody predicted that. I mean, they wouldn't have known, right?
Well, they might have sensed that God would speak, but they thought that God would speak with intense power, you know, maybe with angels and legions and wipe out everybody. That isn't how he does it.
That's part of the importance of the idea that he was a prophet. They knew he was speaking on behalf of God, as the prophets did, but he was speaking in a way that they perhaps did not expect, with a message of his person that was humble and gentle in a way, and not the conqueror that they expected.
According to the New Testament Gospels, here in the region of the ancient city of Caesarea Philippi, a disciple by the name of Peter declared his belief that Jesus was the Christ, the long-awaited Messiah of Israel. It's a statement so bold and provocative that some have suggested that it must have been written back into the Gospels at some later point in church history. Now, I know one of the things that you as scholars have been focusing on is that on the fact that there are other scholars who would take issue with the point you're making, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Is that something you can explain to common folk?
Sure. I mean, most people would say that because Peter's confession or declaration is so strong and so clear, that the early church must have made it up.
After the fact.
Right, after the fact.
They wrote it back in.
We want to have the leader of the church before the crucifixion and resurrection, saying that Jesus is the Christ. But if you think about it, that's rather silly, because in the very next scene, Jesus takes Peter aside and says, "Get behind me, Satan," as we've just been talking about.
Okay, so what you're saying, it doesn't make sense to think that the disciples of the church wrote this clear declaration of Peter back into the text years later.
Not at all. Not at all, because on the one hand, you have Peter having great insight into the person of Jesus, and then in the very next scene, you have Jesus saying, "Get behind me, Satan." That's extremely embarrassing to Peter. The only way we can explain it is that it actually happened in that way.
Why? You're saying because the church wouldn't have written that?
No.
This is what we call the standard of embarrassment.
Yeah, right.
In other words, the church wouldn't write something, if they were creating the story, making out of nothing, that would be inherently embarrassing to one of their leading figures. It undercuts their authority. So the reason it's there is because it was there.
Okay, so that's an argument for historicity.
That's right.
That this really happened. It's not just a story made up.
That's right.
After the, okay, now are those issues in the academic community?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And that's part of what we're trying to do, is that as we deal with these particular events, we use standard criteria that all scholars employ. And so what we're doing is we're playing the game according to the same rules. And so they'll use those same criteria and attempt to discredit this historical scene, whereas we will use the exact same criteria and show how this scene is authentic.
It's not that you don't believe that the Bible is reliable. You're just saying let's talk the language of those who are challenging it.
And we actually think we can take the rules and show how the Bible is trustworthy, even using the rules. We're asking people not to share every assumption that we might have or about what we might believe. We're actually saying we think we can make a case to anyone that this is a plausible, coherent story that we see in these materials.
Okay,
and it's not like we're all of a sudden just giving up the playing field and accepting these rules. We feel that by using these rules, we can actually, for the person who accepts the story, help them to understand the depth of it so much more. It gives a 3D historical depth to what Jesus was doing, and puts him in his context, and makes it so much more understandable.
And so you get all these nuances. You know, here what people think, well, you just confess that Jesus was Messiah, story's over. And well, no, actually, there's a lot going on here. There's a confession of Messiah, but there's a lot of work that Jesus still needs to do on behalf of the disciples to have them get a fuller picture of what it is that he's doing and what he's about.
Okay, is there anything else about this declaration that you think really bears the marks of authenticity?
This is a very awkward place to go. Why would they make up a story about that's the beauty of being here in person. You don't just leave Galilee and jog on up here for the afternoon, play around in the water. This is a major event for them. This is a major traveling journey that is very, very difficult.
To come from the lake region all the way up here to Caesarea Philippi.
Why are you going to make that up?
Yeah.
So what it does is it shows that the authors are really in tune to what's happening with the smallest details. The topography of this place in terms of getting here, what it's all about, is way too detailed just to kind of make up. If it was a person writing 50 years later who had never been here, they wouldn't even know what this is all about.
And think about it. If you're in the midst of Jesus' ministry, you're in this area, Jesus is going to go and try and elicit some type of declaration from his disciples. Would you go north or would you go south?
Yeah.
I mean, you'd go south to Jerusalem. The ministry's been to Israel. But instead we come north. We come to this location that's filled with all this temple association. It's a cultic religious site of the gods.
Why is that important?
Well, it's important because it sets a larger context for Jesus' ministry. It suggests that it's, even though it's been focused on Israel and been about Israel, it's about more than Israel.
Absolutely.
It's beyond Israel.
What's the more?
And the more is the world, Gentiles, everybody else. So we're not just talking about a tradition of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and everything that's associated with that. We're talking about the God who created us, the God who forms life. We're talking about life and death, and this applies to everybody. It doesn't just apply to the people who are within a 100-mile radius of Jerusalem.
And I think that's a very good point that you break that. Why come here? In that sense, what he's doing, he's not just the Messiah of Israel. He's the Messiah of the world. And as he comes here, there's a declaration that these old dead gods that we find here, there's nothing to them.
So if someone says today, a couple of thousand years later, I want that hope, I want that help, but I'm not where you men are. I haven't done the study. My faith isn't that clear. I'm not sure I can declare the same kinds of things. What would you say to someone like that?
I go back to Peter. We are not that different than Peter. We don't want to make him into some exalted figure. He's a person who can get it right and then get it wrong. Mm-hmm. And Jesus, he's going to slap him around and say, look, this is not, don't go Satan's way. Go my way. Be my disciple, and you will find hope. So I think people need to look at Peter as a very realistic figure. And this story paints him as a very realistic kind of a person. He's the kind of a person that I am. My middle name starts with a J, and over the years, my mom meant it to be James when I was named, but it really stands for jerk. I mean, I can be such a jerk.
Another confession.
Jesus reached down 37 years ago and took me out of the pit. And it has been a journey. Peter is on a journey for many years. I have been on a journey for many, many years. And so Peter, as he clearly understands Jesus' identity, he finds hope in who Jesus is all about.
And there's another interesting twist here, and that is that we tend to think that achievement comes through power. And the fact is, many of us don't have very much power. The amount of influence that we exercise is minimal. But what the gospel says, what the word about Jesus, what Jesus' teaching says is that you can come into a relationship with God in which He will give you the power, He will give you the enablement. And more than that, all that you're asked to do and to be is to not exercise power, but to serve, to give, to sacrifice.
As Jesus did.
As Jesus did. And so here Peter is getting this confession. He has this grand portrait of who Jesus should be. And Jesus says, the way I'm going to show the world what the way is not through a huge exaltation, but through this self-sacrifice that I'm entering into. And you're going to walk down the same road with me. Wow. And you will learn more about who you are taking that path than you will than trying to seek glory and honor to yourself.
So Peter's declaration, in a way, becomes a paradigm for our own faith.
Exactly.
Because it's always, if we could say it this way, it's always 2 steps forward, 1 step back, then 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Okay. Peter does that so many times. Even you would think that after this event, and Jesus again correcting him and saying, you're thinking the wrong way, that he would say, okay, now I get it. But what do we see even at the very end of the story? That Peter again messes up. He fails. But I think the whole point of his story is that that's the paradigm that we're walking through. We'll get part of the picture, but then we'll miss part of it as well. But graciously, God continues to bring us along in understanding who Christ is.
Thanks, man.
Excellent.
I left Caesarea Philippi with a greater appreciation for the time and the setting where Jesus asked his disciples that probing question, who do you say that I am? And now, what challenges me even more is what was written in the Gospels next. Jesus spoke to those who wanted to follow him and said, if anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for me and for the gospel will save it. What good is it for a man to gain the whole world, yet forfeit his soul?